On September 7th, 1953, a Hawker Hunter prototype flown by squadron leader Neville Duke lifted off from RAF Tangmere, carrying a fuel load calculated to the pint. The Air Ministry timekeepers had drawn a 3-kilometre corridor along the Sussex coast between Rustington and Ferring, marked by camera stations and a Decca radar plot. Duke had been briefed by Sir Sidney Cam himself the previous evening at the Hawker Works in Kingston. Fly low, fly straight, and do not chase the numbers. The existing world absolute speed record held by an American F-86D Sabre over the Salton Sea stood at 715.75 miles per hour. When Duke landed 42 minutes later, the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale observers logged an average of 727.63 miles per hour across 4 passes, and the Ministry of Supply press office in Shell Mech's house began telephoning Fleet Street. The record lasted 25 days. On October 3rd, 1953, Lieutenant Commander Mike Lithgow took a Supermarine Swift F-4 over a course near Castel Idris in Libya and returned 737.7 miles per hour. Britain now held both the first and second places on the FAI Absolute List, and the Cabinet's Defence Committee, chaired by Winston Churchill, received a paper from the Minister of Supply, Duncan Sandys, arguing that the propaganda value alone justified continued expenditure on transonic research. Attlee's post-war rearmament programme, which the Conservatives had inherited in October 1951, was already running at £4.7 billion over 3 years, and the Treasury was hostile. Sandys wanted more. What neither Whitehall nor the American aviation press yet appreciated was that a third British aircraft was being prepared, and its projected performance sat in a different category altogether. At Fairey Aviation's Heston plant, a delta-winged research aircraft designated the FD.2 was undergoing final assembly. It had been ordered under specification ER-103 issued in October 1950, a document drafted by the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough after the JIC's Scientific Intelligence Subcommittee circulated assessments of Soviet swept-wing development at TSAGI. The air staff wanted a transonic data-gathering platform. What they were about to receive was something else. Peter Twiss, chief test pilot at Fairey, first flew the FD.2 from Boscombe Down on October 6, 1954. The aircraft was 17 metres long, weighed just over 6 tonnes, and was powered by a single Rolls-Royce Avon RA.14, producing 9,500 pounds of dry thrust. Its droop snoot nose, later borrowed by the Concorde design team at Filton, gave the pilot visibility during the extreme nose-up landing attitude the Delta planform required. On the third flight, the engine flamed out at 30,000 feet over Salisbury Plain. Twiss dead-sticked the aircraft back to Boscombe, an act of airmanship that the RAE report of December 1954 described in language unusually warm for an official document. The repairs took 9 months. By early 1956, the FD.2 was performing Mach 1.5 runs routinely, and the Ministry of Supply, now under Reginald Maudling, quietly asked Fairey whether an attempt on the world absolute record might be feasible. The standing figure was 822 miles per hour, set by Colonel Horace Haynes in an F-100C Super Sabre at Palmdale in August 1955. Maudling wanted a British answer before the Farnborough Air Show that September. Twiss and the Fairey team began planning a course over the south coast and asked the Air Ministry for permission to exceed the sound barrier over populated ground. The permission, when it came back through the office of the Secretary of State for Air, Nigel Birch, contained a single condition that would shape the entire attempt. The condition was altitude. Sonic booms at low level had already generated complaints to members of Parliament from residents near Boscombe Down, and Birch's office insisted that any record attempt take place above 36,000 feet. This transformed the exercise. The existing FAI absolute record category required the course to be flown between 2 fixed points, timed by ground-based observers at an altitude where atmospheric conditions could be verified. The Americans had run their attempts at low level over dry lake beds, precisely because temperature and pressure could be measured with certainty. Britain proposed to do it at nearly 7 miles up. The FAI rules of 1956 permitted high-altitude attempts but required kinetheodolite tracking from at least 2 ground stations, temperature soundings by weather balloon within 1 hour of the run, and a maximum altitude deviation of 100 metres between the 2 timing gates. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough was tasked with the mathematics. Dr. Maurian Morgan, later the technical director of the Concorde project, personally supervised the calculation of atmospheric correction factors. His team worked from the RAE's converted wartime huts, using Ferranti-Pegasus computing time borrowed from the Guided Weapons Division. The course was surveyed along the Chichester Peninsula, running from Ford Aerodrome in Sussex to Chichester Cathedral and back, a 15-kilometre baseline flown twice in opposing directions to cancel out any wind component. 2 Vickers-Valletta aircraft borrowed from RAF Transport Command were fitted with the kinetheodolite cameras. Ground stations were established at Fontwell Park Racecourse and at a farm near Yapton. The Meteorological Office at Dunstable committed to release a radiosonde balloon from Crawley 30 minutes before each attempt. Nothing on this scale had been attempted for a record flight before. Twiss made his first serious approach on March 10, 1956. The Avon flamed out during the acceleration run at 38,000 feet, and he glided the FD.2 back to Ford in weather that was closing rapidly. The Rolls-Royce team at Hucknall, led by Adrian Lombard, stripped the engine over the weekend and identified a fuel system icing problem at altitudes above 35,000 feet. A modification was fitted by March 9th. At 11:45 on the morning of March 10, 1956, Twiss took off from Boscombe Down, climbed to 38,000 feet over the English Channel, and turned northwest to line up on the Ford Chichester baseline. The kinetheodolite operators at Fontwell and Yapton had been briefed to expect the aircraft in a shallow descent. The FAI observer, Mr. W. E. P. Johnson of the Royal Aero Club, was stationed at Ford with a synchronized chronograph. Twiss opened the throttle to full military power and stabilized at Mach 1.72. The 2 runs took a combined 94 seconds. When the film from the kinetheodolites was developed at Farnborough that evening, and the temperature corrections applied, the average speed came out at 1,132 miles per hour, or 1,822 kilometers per hour. The previous record of 822 miles per hour had been exceeded by 310 miles per hour, an increase of 37%. No world absolute speed record before or since has been broken by such a margin in a single attempt. The Ministry of Supply issued a communiqué at 22:15 that evening, and the following morning's Times carried the story on the front page above news of the Cyprus emergency. In Washington, the reaction was immediate, and in the case of one 3-star general at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, publicly incredulous. The margin was, he told Aviation Week, aerodynamically implausible. The general's skepticism was not eccentric. American transonic research through 1955 had been conducted primarily at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics facility at Langley Field and at Edwards Air Force Base, where the X-1A, X-2 and F-100 series had been probed methodically through the Mach 1 to Mach 2 regime. The prevailing view among NACA aerodynamicists, articulated by Richard Whitcomb in his 1952 Area Rule Papers, was that a slender delta of the FD.2's configuration should experience severe transonic drag rise around Mach 1.2 and stability problems above Mach 1.4. That an aircraft weighing 6 tons on a single Avon could reach Mach 1.72 in level flight suggested either the British had lied about the airframe, or Rolls-Royce had built an engine substantially more powerful than the published figures. Neither was true, and the reason took American analysts nearly 18 months to work out. The FD.2 exploited 3 characteristics that Farnborough had understood before Langley did. The first was the aerodynamic advantage of the pure delta at high altitude, where reduced air density lowered the drag penalty of the large wing area. The second was the aircraft's exceptionally low wing loading, which allowed it to sustain Mach 1.7 at 38,000 feet, without the induced drag climbing to prohibitive levels. The third and most significant was the RAE's work on leading-edge vortex lift, conducted by Dietrich Küchemann and Johanna Weber at Farnborough throughout the early 1950s. Küchemann, a German aerodynamicist recruited by the RAE at the end of the war under Operation Surgeon, had published a series of papers between 1951 and 1955 on the flow behavior of highly swept slender wings. He had realized that at moderate angles of attack, such wings generated a pair of stable leading-edge vortices that produced additional non-linear lift, effectively reducing the induced drag at high speed. This work was classified until 1955 and not fully appreciated in the United States until the following year. The Fairey FD.2 was the first aircraft designed to exploit it operationally, and the same principle would be used in the Handley-Page HP-115, the BAC-221, and ultimately in Concorde itself. The intelligence dimension became clear during the summer of 1956. The Joint Intelligence Committee circulated a paper on July 18th, drafted by the Air Ministry's Directorate of Scientific Intelligence, noting that Soviet aviation attachés had made 3 separate approaches to Fairey personnel at trade events in Paris and Brussels, offering what were described as commercial discussions about the FD.2. The Foreign Office instructed Sir Frederick Hoyer Miller, the Permanent Undersecretary, to alert MI5's D branch. Peter Twiss received a personal briefing at Leconfield House from a D branch officer whose name has not been declassified. The Soviet interest was not idle. The MiG-21 prototype, then known as the Yer-4, had first flown on June 16, 1955, and was suffering from precisely the transonic drag problems Küchemann's work addressed. Whether Soviet intelligence obtained anything useful from Fairey has never been established. The MiG-21 that entered service in 1959 used a tailed delta configuration, rather than the pure delta of the FD.2, suggesting either independent development or an incomplete transfer. For Whitehall, the record had immediate political utility. Anthony Eden, 4 months from the Suez landings, and already under pressure from the Treasury over defence expenditure, invited Twiss to Downing Street on March 21, 1956. The photograph shows Eden clasping Twiss's hand outside the black door of number 10, wearing an expression that the Daily Express caption writer described as quietly delighted. Eden had reason to be delighted. The Global Strategy paper of 1952, drafted by the Chiefs of Staff under Sir John Slessor, had committed Britain to a defence posture based on nuclear deterrence and technological superiority in specific niches rather than mass conventional forces. The FD.2 record was, in one sense, an advertisement for that strategy. But it was also an advertisement for something more specific. The industrial base that Duncan Sandys and his officials at the Ministry of Supply were about to reorganize, dismember, and, in significant part, destroy. Sandys became Minister of Defence on January 14, 1957. His white paper of April 4th that year, formally titled Defence Outline of Future Policy, and universally known as the Sandys White Paper, argued that manned combat aircraft were becoming obsolete and would be superseded by ballistic missiles within a decade. The document cancelled or curtailed a range of British aircraft projects, including the Avro 730 supersonic bomber, the Saunders-Roe SR-177 mixed-power interceptor, and eventually the Fairey Delta research program itself. Twiss's record had been set in an aircraft type that the government was in the process of declaring redundant. The paradox was noted at the time. Sir George Edwards of Vickers Armstrongs wrote privately to Sandys in May 1957 that the FD.2 represented the finest expression of the specific advantages this country has developed in the aerodynamic sciences, and that its cancellation would surrender to the Americans a position bought at considerable cost. Sandys replied that the Cabinet's decision was final. The FD.2 flew on as a research aircraft, but no operational derivative was ordered. Fairey Aviation itself was absorbed into Westland Helicopters in 1960, and the Heston plant closed. What survived was the aerodynamic knowledge. Maurian Morgan, appointed chairman of the Supersonic Transport Aircraft Committee in November 1956, drew directly on the FD.2 data for the initial studies that led to Concorde. The second FD.2 WG777 was substantially rebuilt by the British Aircraft Corporation between 1961 and 1964, redesignated the BAC-221 and used to test the ogival delta wing planform that would appear on Concorde. The aircraft that had broken the world speed record in 1956 was, 10 years later, taxiing at Filton in the livery of a supersonic transport program. For the RAF, the practical inheritance was more complex. The Air Staff Requirement OR.329, issued in January 1955, called for a Mach 2 interceptor to defend the V-bomber bases against Soviet bombers coming over the pole. English Electric's response was the P.1B, which entered service in 1959 as the Lightning F.1. The Lightning drew on transonic research at Wharton and at the RAE, and its aerodynamic layout owed nothing directly to the FD.2. But the political climate created by Twiss's record, the sense that Britain could still produce world-beating combat aircraft, kept the Lightning program alive through the Sandys Review when Saunders-Roe's SR-177 was cancelled. Twiss himself continued at Fairey until 1959, when he took a role in the Fairey Marine boat-building subsidiary at Hamble. He had been offered a knighthood in the summer of 1956 and declined, taking instead the Queen's Commendation for valuable service in the air, gazetted on June 8, 1956. His logbook, later deposited at the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton, records the 2 runs of March 10, 1956, in the standard black ink of routine test flying, with no annotation to distinguish them from any other sortie. The American response to Twiss's record moved into a different phase in December 1957. On December 12, 1957, Major Adrian Drew of the U.S. Air Force flew a Macdonald F-101A Voodoo over a low-level course at Edwards Air Force Base and recorded 1,207 miles per hour, breaking the FD.2 record by 75 miles per hour. The American recovery had taken 21 months, and the aircraft used was substantially heavier and more powerful than the FD.2. 2 Pratt and Whitney J57 engines producing a combined 30,000 pounds of thrust against the Avon's 9,500 pounds. On a thrust-to-weight basis, the FD.2 record remained the more impressive achievement, and this was acknowledged in the Aviation Week analysis of December 23, 1957. The absolute speed record then moved into a phase of American dominance that persisted through the Cold War. The Lockheed YF-12A reached 2,070 miles per hour in 1965, and the SR-71 Blackbird would set the final piston jet era record at 2,193 miles per hour in July 1976. British aviation had a single moment at the top of the FAI list from March 1956 to December 1957, and did not return. The strategic context in which the record had been set was, by then, unrecognizable. The Suez Crisis of October to November 1956 had exposed the limits of British power in a way that no aerodynamic achievement could disguise. Eden resigned on January 9, 1957. Harold Macmillan, replacing him at number 10, delivered the Wind of Change speech to the South African Parliament on February 3, 1960, formally acknowledging the end of empire. The Sandys White Paper had already begun the contraction of the British aircraft industry. Between 1957 and 1965, the number of independent British airframe manufacturers reduced from 23 to 2. The intelligence services drew a different lesson. The Cushman-Weber work on slender wing aerodynamics had produced a genuine British advantage. one that the Americans could not replicate for over a year because the underlying theory was not fully in the public domain. This was, from the perspective of the JIC's Scientific Intelligence Subcommittee, a model for how British research could compete. Identify narrow technical domains where British theoretical work had a lead, protect the results and exploit them in projects that generated diplomatic and commercial returns. Sir Frederick Brundrett, the chief scientific advisor at the Ministry of Defence until 1959, argued this case repeatedly in Cabinet Office papers. The doctrine was applied unevenly. Concorde, launched jointly with France under the Anglo-French Treaty of November 29, 1962, was in one sense a direct application of the FD.2 lesson, British aerodynamic superiority in the slender delta configuration, translated into a commercial and diplomatic product. The programme cost £1.134 billion by the time the aircraft entered service in January 1976, against an original estimate of £150 million to £170 million. 16 aircraft were built. The financial return to the British Treasury was negligible. Twiss lived until August 31, 2011, dying at the age of 90 in Salisbury. His obituary in the Daily Telegraph noted that the FD.2 record had been broken by a margin never subsequently matched. The Fairey Delta II, serial WG774, is preserved at the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton, mounted on a plinth outside the main hall. The kinethiodolite film from the Ford course, held at the National Archives at Kew in file AVIA 6/2 0185, was declassified in 1987. The papers of the Ministry of Supply's Directorate of Scientific Research, released to Kew in stages between 1988 and 2001, contain a detailed record of what Cushman and Weber had achieved and how the American aerospace establishment had been unable, for 18 months, to reproduce it. The Cushman papers, catalogued at Kew under references AVIA 6 and D, SIR 23, describe a research program that had begun in 1946 at the RAE and continued without interruption for a decade. Cushman arrived at Farnborough on August 12, 1946, one of 86 German aerodynamicists brought to Britain under Operation Surgeon by the Ministry of Aircraft Production. He had worked during the war at the Aerodynamische Versuchsanstalt at Göttingen under Ludwig Prantl and Adolf Busemann, and his personal file at TNA W0208/5622 records that his interrogators in 1945 assessed him as of first-class ability and of proven integrity. Johanna Weber joined him at Farnborough in 1947. Their collaboration produced between 1949 and 1955 the theoretical framework for slender-wing supersonic flight. The key papers were RAE reports Aero 2506, Cushman, 1954, on the aerodynamics of swept wings at high Mach numbers, and Aero 2508, Weber, 1954, on the flow around slender delta planforms. These documents were classified secret until 1957. They were circulated within the RAE, the Aircraft Research Association at Bedford, and to a controlled list of manufacturers including Fairey, Handley Page, Vickers, and Bristol. The Americans knew of Cushman's work. He had lectured at Wright-Patterson in September 1953 and at Cornell in October 1953 at the invitation of the Institute of the Aeronautical Sciences. But the lectures had been carefully sanitized of the specific data on vortex lift and the design methodology for exploiting it. When Twiss set his record in March 1956, American aerodynamicists at NACA Langley possessed enough theoretical background to understand what had happened in principle, but not the design tools to reproduce it. Whitcomb's area rule addressed one aspect of transonic drag. Cushman's vortex lift theory addressed another. The gap closed slowly. Edward Polomus at NACA, Langley published his own theoretical treatment of vortex lift on slender wings in 1966, 10 years after Twiss's record and long after the underlying British work had entered the open literature. By then, Concorde was in detailed design, and the Anglo-French team at Filton and Toulouse were using Cushman's methods directly. The ogival delta of Concorde is a Cushman wing. The security dimension of the FD.2 record became a subject of internal Whitehall discussion in 1958. The Radcliffe Committee on Security in the Public Service, which reported on March 5, 1962, examined the handling of classified aeronautical research and concluded that the RAE's compartmentalization of the Slender Wing program had been notably effective. The committee's report, HMSO, Command 1681, is available at Kew. A parallel review by the JIC's Scientific Intelligence Subcommittee, held in the DEFE 21 series at Kew, examined whether the Soviet approaches to Fairey personnel in 1956 had yielded anything. The conclusion was that they had not, though the file notes the caveat that absence of evidence in this domain is not evidence of absence. The Fairey aviation records deposited at the RAF Museum at Hendon in 1966, after the Westland absorption, contain the flight test data from the record attempts. The relevant volume, catalogued as X001-2340, includes Twiss's flight test cards for March 10, 1956 in his own handwriting. The card for the second run notes only Mach 1.72, 38,000 feet, OAT minus 56 degrees Celsius, engine normal. Twiss had been asked in 1990 by a BBC researcher for a more expansive account of the flight and had replied that there had been nothing dramatic about it. The aircraft had behaved exactly as Cushman's calculations predicted. That predictability was the point. Farnborough had built an aircraft to a theory, and the theory had worked. The theory worked because it had been correct, and being correct in aerodynamics required a specific kind of institutional culture that the RAE possessed, and the American establishment in 1956 did not. The RAE at Farnborough employed roughly 8,000 people in 1955, of whom approximately 900 were graduate scientists or engineers. It maintained 15 wind tunnels, including the 24-foot low-speed tunnel opened in 1935 and the 8-foot by 6-foot transonic tunnel commissioned in 1956. The budget for the aerodynamics department alone in the financial year 1955 to 56 was £4.2 million, a figure that Sir Cyril Hinshelwood, the president of the Royal Society, described in a letter to the Times as modest for the scale of the intellectual return. The comparison with the American arrangement is instructive. NACA in 1955 was distributed across 3 main laboratories: Langley in Virginia, Ames in California, and Lewis in Ohio. The combined staff exceeded 8,000. NACA had superior equipment and greater budgets. What it lacked in the specific domain of slender wing supersonic aerodynamics was the concentration of expertise that the RAE had assembled through the recruitment of Cushman, Weber, and their colleagues from the German programs. This was a legacy of the war, and it had a shelf life. By 1962, when the Anglo-French Concorde Agreement was signed, the RAE's lead had already begun to erode. American research on vortex lift, funded by the US Air Force through contracts with Boeing and North American, was catching up. The XB-70 Valkyrie, which flew on September 21, 1964, incorporated aerodynamic principles that owed something to independent American development and something to open publications by British authors. By the late 1960s, the specific advantage that had produced the FD.2 record had been dissipated into the common technical literature of supersonic flight. The strategic question that Whitehall faced in the late 1950s was whether the FD.2 model could be sustained or whether it had been a one-off. Sir Solly Zuckerman, appointed Chief Scientific Advisor to the Ministry of Defence in January 1960, argued that it could not be sustained without a fundamental restructuring of British research and a concentration of resources on fewer projects. His paper of March 1961, The Management of Defense Research, circulated to the Defense Council, called for the abolition of the Ministry of Supply and the transfer of research functions to a unified Ministry of Defense. This was implemented in April 1964. Zuckerman's diagnosis was that Britain had, in 1956, spent the intellectual capital accumulated during the war. The Cushman-Weber work at Farnborough, the Whittle turbojet research at Rolls-Royce, and the radar developments at Malvern had all originated in projects funded during the wartime emergency. The FD.2 record had drawn on the last of that capital. Future British competitiveness in aerospace, Zuckerman argued, would require a different funding model and different institutional arrangements. The record itself became, in the historical memory of British aviation, a marker of what had been possible and what had been surrendered. When Concorde 002 made its first flight from Filton on April 9, 1969, piloted by Brian Trubshaw, the technical lineage back to the FD.2 was direct and acknowledged. When British Aerospace was formed on April 29, 1977 by the nationalisation of Hawker Siddeley Aviation, Hawker Siddeley Dynamics, the British Aircraft Corporation and Scottish Aviation, the industry that had produced the FD.2 no longer existed in the form it had taken in 1956. What remained was the film from the Kynetheodolites at Fontwell and Yapton, the flight test cards in Twiss's hand, and a set of RAE reports. The RAE reports, released in stages from the mid-1980s onwards, allowed a generation of historians to assemble the fuller picture. Peter Hennessy's work on the machinery of British government drew on the cabinet papers of the Eden and Macmillan administrations to show how the FD.2 record had been received in Downing Street. Christopher Andrews' Authorized History of MI5, published in 2009, mentioned the Fairey approaches of 1956 in a single sentence, citing the D branch case file. Lawrence Freedman's History of British Nuclear Strategy set the record within the broader context of the technological posture Slessor and Sandys had chosen. The most useful primary source, however, remained the flight test data itself. The Air Historical Branch at RAF Northolt holds the complete Fairey aviation archive, including the Cushman-Weber correspondence with the RAE from 1949 to 1955. The Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton holds Twiss's logbook and personal papers, donated by his widow in 2012. The Science Museum at Kensington holds the second FD.2, WG777, in its final BAC221 configuration. The IWM at Duxford holds none of the FD.2 material directly, but retains the operational records of RAF Tangmere and Ford, from which the record attempt was staged. The final American acknowledgement came in 1997 when Richard Whitcomb, by then retired from what had become NASA Langley, was interviewed for an oral history project by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Asked about the FD.2 record, Whitcomb said that the British achievement in March 1956 had been considerably ahead of where we thought anyone was, and that the specific combination of slender wing aerodynamics and high-altitude flight had caught us by surprise. He attributed the surprise to a failure of American intelligence rather than a failure of American engineering, a distinction that had, 40 years earlier, been the subject of the JYC Scientific Intelligence Subcommittee's private satisfaction. The record itself was surpassed within 21 months and superseded within a decade by aircraft that operated in different flight regimes altogether. The SR-71 Blackbird cruised at Mach 3.2 at 80,000 feet. The X-15 rocket plane reached Mach 6.7. Absolute speed as a category of aeronautical achievement ceased to matter in the way it had mattered in 1956. What the FD.2 had demonstrated was not that Britain could fly faster than anyone else, but that, at a specific moment, with specific tools and specific people, British aerodynamic theory had produced an outcome that American engineering could not immediately explain. That was a Cold War achievement of a particular kind. It was not the achievement of the V-bombers which delivered a nuclear deterrent from RAF stations at Wittering, Cottesmore and Marham throughout the 1960s. It was not the achievement of the Polaris program, which put British nuclear warheads at sea aboard HMS Resolution from June 15, 1968. It was not the achievement of GCHQ at Cheltenham, whose signals intelligence work on the Warsaw Pact was, at the time of Twiss's record, still classified at the highest levels and would remain so for decades. It was an achievement of the specific British capacity to think in a narrow and difficult domain, more clearly than anyone else for a short period. The window closed, Whitehall spent the following 35 years attempting, in various programs and with varying success, to reproduce the conditions under which it had opened. The Fairey Delta, too, stands at Yeovilton, a physical record of what those conditions had briefly produced.